today we have Hamilton Morris on the show. And so I was really studying your journalism journey, what one could say. And I thought it was so interesting that in 2012, there was this, let's say this when your show started, it was this kind of cool, colorful, almost like band leader dude-looking guy who was running in between like psychedelic colors, and now you kind of seem to be this, let's say, rather scientifically. You come across rather like a scientist if you just also watch the trailer. So, what would you say has really happened between this time where you started to go to the Amazon and kind of experiment, and now you rather come across like somebody who really works in a laboratory?
Well, one very crucial thing that's happened is I started working in a lab. That's maybe one very literal change that has occurred. When those first videos were made, I was still in college. I was 21 when I made the first one. And I had studied science, but I didn't have any personal experience with lab work of any kind. And as I was evolving in my reporting, I was also evolving in my knowledge of the subject. I started working with a chemist named Jason Wallach at a small pharmacy school in Philadelphia called the University of the Sciences. And that's probably the change that you're observing. We have done an enormous amount of research together, published peer-reviewed scientific publications, and I was always interested in the scientific aspects of this world. But as I continued working, I became more personally involved with it, and also more personally involved with the creation of the show. At the beginning, I sort of saw myself as a writer that was writing articles about these things and making a video to accompany the article. But the article was what I was really interested in creating. And then I started to embrace the filmmaking aspects of it. And especially in the third season, due to a number of factors, COVID, a lot of the people that I was working with had to leave the production for various reasons. It ended up being, more like making an independent film than a TV show. There were very, very few people working on it. And so I had a lot of control over everything that I did, pretty much complete control. And at the beginning, I suppose I had a little bit less, I just didn't understand the filmmaking aspects as well. I never studied film production or anything like that. So I didn't think about what lenses I was using or how best to tell a story cinematically. That is just something that evolved as well.
Okay. But I mean, like, I watched this one episode where you were traveling to South America to get the frog poison burned into your arm. And I mean, you were like, how old were you? Like, 21, right? That was very much the beginning. So, but it seemed that you were already very much interested in being like a guinea pig, or like to have a guinea pig experience, which most people, I feel like, in the psychedelic field develop rather later. So, but you were very like, I'm doing this, I feel like this. So it was very precise.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think people are cautious about acknowledging their own experiences with these things. And part of it was just that I was naive. I was 21. I didn't know that people would really care about it one way or another. So, lots of people use Philomedusa bicolor skin secretions. It's not that unusual. Hunter Biden has done it.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was a little bit less common, but I saw no reason not to try it myself. That video was made for what at the time was a pretty small audience. This was not made for YouTube. It wasn't on YouTube for years. It was on a small proprietary player, and it was just a different time. I didn't know. I certainly didn't expect that people would continue watching that. A decade later, people still talk about that piece. I haven't watched it since I made it. I can imagine that I wouldn't like it if I looked at it now, mostly because I've learned a lot about how people respond to things, what sorts of things are enraging, what sorts of things are interesting, how best to handle these subjects in such a way that they are uh, better understood by people. So that early work is not, it's not something I'm really that interested in outside of, it's where I started, but it's not something that I would recommend to anyone. Say, oh, check out this thing that I made when I was 21. But people still talk about it. I think people still talk about it often in the context of criticizing me,
Oh, really?
even
Oh,
though
okay.
yeah, I think so. Because even though I think the subsequent work that I've made has been viewed by far more people, that has been a kind of thing that people, if they're criticizing me, they'll point out, like, this guy used to be so edgy. He did this thing that, as far as I'm concerned, is
Oh,
not all that edgy.
okay.
Uh, but you know, that's the attitude, and also just this kind of, people make such a big deal out of consuming these things on camera. It's almost, I think, analogous to the way that people make a big deal um, out of like nudity or sex on camera, even though it's very common. Most people have sex. Most people are naked. All people are naked at some point. If you do it on camera, suddenly it's a huge deal.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that I didn't quite understand at the beginning, because I thought, okay, well, this is interesting. This is, something people will find educational, but I didn't think that it would be so sensational in people's eyes.
I mean, it had something very precise, though. I mean, I can understand what you say, that you're like, okay, you were young, you were just trying it out, and you didn't really, look into what you were doing there. But it had almost something to me like a scientific research
Well, I was interested,
precision. Yeah,
at that time, yeah, I was interested, of
yeah.
course, in the pharmacology and the chemistry of all of it. But it was just a different time.
Okay. So, I mean, I listened to your podcast with Tim Ferriss and saw the Joe Rogan show. And I mean, a big topic for you now, I feel, is to be very responsible as a journalist in terms of psychedelics.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And I mean, which is great. And can you talk a little bit about how this, let's say, responsibility developed over the last years?
Yeah. Well, again, this is something that comes with gaining an appreciation of what happens when you talk about something in the public sphere. When you are a normal person with no experience conveying a message to millions or tens of millions of people, you assume that people understand you and get what you are doing. You assume that when you make a joke, people know that your joke is a joke. You assume that when you're doing something for innocent purposes, that people understand that it's innocent. But when you start making things for a large audience, you realize people will not necessarily get the jokes that I'm making. People will not necessarily interpret the things that I'm doing correctly. And something small uh, can have a really big impact. Even just talking about a drug can suddenly establish a market for that drug, or can alter people's attitudes toward that drug for better or worse. I mean, I wrote an article with Jason Wallach years ago about a chemical called 5-bromo-DMT, which is the only psychedelic that's ever been isolated from the ocean, and only the ocean. And it was kind of an oddity that had been described by Alexander Shulgin and some natural product chemists. And we published the first human evaluation of that particular drug. I think within a couple of months, it was available as a gray market commodity from China. There were reports on Reddit of people smoking it, reports of people injecting it. And that was also a kind of stark confrontation with the influence and the responsibility that comes with talking about these things publicly.
But I mean, is it also that people, I mean, people must have approached you, and I mean, since you're doing this show, in terms of what are you doing, and is this kind of, are you glamorizing drugs? Is this something that happened, or what was it? Was that never really something that happened, or where people just complained in a way?
It's not so much glamorizing drugs. I think there's a lot of people that misconstrue the motivation as they want to reduce it and they want to pretend that it's about using a drug. That was another thing that I learned early on, is that people would say, "Oh, this guy just wants to get high,"
Oh,
and
okay.
uh, and that was like one of the most bizarre criticisms of all, because I would think, well, surely if I wanted to get high, if the point was to use a drug, I wouldn't make a documentary about it.
Exactly, yeah.
That makes it uh, conservatively 100 times more difficult, maybe more like 1,000 times more difficult. If you want to use a drug, you can just use it privately and not put it on the internet and not make a documentary about it. It's far, far, far easier. I can tell you that from experience, having made a documentary in which I use a drug and having used drugs without cameras present. If you're looking to use a drug, definitely I encouraged you to do it without cameras if the point is to just use a drug.
Yeah.
But that was an idea, and I think again this comes from this idea that no one could ever actually be interested in drugs as a subject for science or filmmaking. The intention would have to be some kind of purely hedonist drug taking motivation. Um, yeah. So, and I began to recognize uh, the extraordinary power of consuming a drug. I mean, I even at one point calculated how much of my show is me using a drug. It's maybe like 2 or 3% of the footage of the actual TV show, but people sometimes treat it like it's 100%. They neglect the,
Oh, okay.
97, 98% that is chemistry, that is, uh, interviews with scientists, that is historical, everything else, because there's something so, I guess, amazing to people about consuming a psychoactive drug. So that's, I another thing that I learned was just how distracting it is to incorporate that type of footage into an episode.
But I mean, it's also, I think, because there are not that many, let's say, yeah, narratives, but not many pictures around somebody doing a psychedelic, and besides the typical, movies where it's actually, oh, it's making, somebody's making fun, like the director's making fun of somebody, some character doing LSD, or like celebrities doing weird jokes on doing psychedelics. So there's not that many footage, I want to say, around where you can actually see how this actually could look like if somebody does that. So I think this is also
I mean,
something.
there's a lot on YouTube. There's a ton. I mean, pretty much any drug. So much that
Yeah.
researchers even use YouTube as a tool to study. That was part of my salvia episode. Is I
Okay.
interviewed somebody who did an entire, published an entire paper studying human response to salvia via YouTube videos.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Good.
Um, yeah,
Okay. But I mean, I feel like most of these videos then look so horrible that you don't want to, you just skip them after. Or then you get, your algorithm tells you another 100 more, and you just can't stop, maybe sometimes. But I mean,
yeah.
still, not a lot of them are really good. But so when was the time when you really thought you would get into becoming more like a chemist, or when did that really kind of start to take you in?
Probably around 2009, I met this chemist, Jason Wallach, and we initially collaborated on analysis of a zombie powder sample that I'd collected in Haiti to see if it contained this chemical called TTX. And it did not contain TTX, but we became friends and started doing a lot of chemistry work together. At that time, and really up until very recently, the idea that there would be any kind of financial support for psychedelic research seemed out of the question. Um, all of the chemists that I admired, like Alexander Shulgin, had worked without funding, without much institutional support. Someone like David Nichols is maybe an exception, but even he, I don't think, was able to receive large amounts of funding for the chemistry that he was doing. But the nice thing about chemistry is that if you're working at a university that already has analytical instruments and a lab set up, you can do a lot of work for not that much money. It's not like doing, human clinical trials where millions of dollars of funding are required to set up even a small experiment. And so, yeah, we were able to do a lot of work, and we continue working together to this day. And that's what happened. Yeah.
Then you got kind of sucked into also like maybe producing instead of just kind of showing, right? These things. Was that something that happened?
I mean, I was always very active in making the pieces. I just didn't. There was also less money. We were,
Yeah, sure.
filming with one camera. There was no professional sound recording. It was made. The early pieces were made with me, a producer, and one other person who's holding a camera. And the creative possibilities were limited. The budgets were smaller. It wasn't until I started working on the HBO news show that Vice had that I started, working with two cameras simultaneously and using professional
Hmm.
sound, and started to learn more about how to put together a slightly more polished piece. But again, all these things, both the science and the filmmaking, were a slow learning process that spanned over a decade.
Hmm. And I mean, are you interested actually in moving further also in psychedelic research now? Is this something that you are more and more interested
Very
in
much.
now?
That's what I'm doing.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing exclusively now.
Okay. So, but can you imagine also like in a university context to do that?
That is what I'm doing. Yeah,
Okay. Sorry, I
I
didn't.
am working full time at a university
Oh,
in
okay.
the
Sorry,
now.
because that's kind of hard to find about you. That's not really. Okay. So, what university is it? Which one?
It's the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia,
Okay.
and they recently got a lot of funding to
Mm-hmm.
do psychedelic research,
Mm-hmm.
and so I am going to be working full time, actually
Wow.
starting this month, with
Okay.
Jason Wallach in this new psychedelic drug discovery center, designing new psychedelic drugs. So that's something that's very exciting, and it's strange because in the past it was far easier to get funding to make documentaries about psychedelics than it was to get funding to actually study psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now that has changed.
Yeah.
There's so much pharmaceutical and business interest in psychedelics that there is a tremendous amount of funding and resources available now to do scientific research. And that is the main reason that I'm making this transition, is because suddenly that's easier to do. And this is something that I, would have always wanted to do. I even, um, at one point, there was a change in drug policy in New Zealand where they established they established some laws that would allow people to sell recreational drugs if they underwent some version of a clinical trial. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
you are you familiar with this?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There was this guy Matt Bowden,
Mm-hmm.
and he had what was essentially a pharmaceutical lab, and they would design drugs without any kind of medical pretense. These drugs were not meant to treat PTSD or
Mm-hmm.
depression
Mm-hmm.
or anything of that nature. It was done explicitly to produce an enjoyable drug effect in healthy adults. And I thought that was amazing. I was so excited by that research that I was wanted to move to New Zealand to work in that lab,
Mm-hmm.
because I thought that was the first time anything like that had ever been possible. But subsequently, the lab that he was working at was shut down, and the research that he was doing on synthetic cannabinoids became very controversial. Um, and there was another 6-7 years before something remotely analogous became possible in the United States.
I mean, what is the thing? What is your idea? What you would like to make or to research or to create at this point? Do you have a specific thing in mind,
Yeah,
molecule in mind?
yeah, there are, yeah, there are all sorts of specific research goals. But one of the main ones is basic exploration. I think that what Shulgin did was, on one hand, very open-ended, non-hypothesis driven exploratory research, where he wasn't saying, oh, okay, I want to replace the bromine atom in 2CB with an iodine atom in order to see if it better treats PTSD. He was doing basic structure activity relationship research to see what happened. And by the standards of most contemporary science, which is almost always hypothesis driven, it's a little bit weird to say, what am I doing? I'm just exploring, I'm just seeing what happens. But using that research methodology, he was able to make an absolutely extraordinary number of scientifically and medically important discoveries. So I think that that basic desire to explore the unknown, to design new compounds, examine their pharmacology, and see if new unanticipated effects are observed, will continue to yield useful new substances. But of course, there's also a lot of interest in optimizing the therapeutic properties of the psychedelics that are um, currently being examined as potential treatments for various psychological disorders.
So, I mean, one thing that's becoming popular, I feel, is that the research to create, to find a substance or to kind of tweak psychedelics, that the psychedelic experience would not happen, but let's say the cure for depression or anxiety would come out of this. And some people say this is great because like if anybody would say, yeah, well, but you have to go to suffer to go through to go through your trauma, and it might be very difficult to go through this, but then you would come out of the other end, and it would be great. You kind of cured. So, and then some people would say to that, well, that's a very puritanical way of looking at it, that you need to suffer to find a cure to your trauma or something. So, how's your take on the, let's say, this kind of, I want to say, like, big discussion around the non-psychoactive cure with psychedelics?
The non-psychoactive cure with
Yeah.
psychedelics?
Well, I mean, in a way,
What do you mean?
in a way that, I mean, a lot of people say, or like a lot of researchers also say, that they would actually be interested in finding psychedelics that
Oh,
don't have
yeah.
the psychedelic
Yeah.
experience, but
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, but you could come out with the same effect as with the psychedelic experience.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Okay. Sure. Yeah. I'm open to it. I'm open to everything. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people want to make rules about what is right or
Yeah.
what is wrong. And we're at a juncture where there is so much that is not known, that I'm open to anyone doing whatever they think is valuable. I think that if I had to bet, that that's probably not the best path. That would be my guess. I could easily be wrong. I mean, there is now quite a bit of research that is controversial in its applicability to humans, that suggests that you can strip away aspects of the psychoactivity of psychedelics and retain some sort of therapeutic effect via neurogenesis.
Yeah.
But um, I am skeptical. I'm skeptical, but I'm also happy that people are looking at these things. I think it's all part of the process of understanding the pharmacology of these substances. So anyone that's doing that, I wish them the best. I think the track record for it hasn't been great historically. There was 18MC, which was an early attempt to strip away the psychedelic properties of ibogaine,
Oh, wow. Okay.
and it worked on some level, in that it retained the affinity for the hypothesized anti-addictive nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, but it also lost other aspects that are considered desirable, like the release of neurotrophic factors like BDNF and GDNF. So, and I don't think it ever, made it to human clinical trials, as far as I know. So people have been trying this for a while, and I wish them the best of luck. But in my personal experience using psychedelics, it has always felt that the psychoactive properties and the psychological experience is a crucial component of what makes them therapeutic and unlike other drugs. So, I would hope that I know that people are very worried about that. They're saying, oh, pharmaceutical companies are going to strip away everything that makes these substances visionary and spiritual and desirable. My guess is that even if they want to do that, it's probably not going to work out all that well. So it's probably a moot point ultimately, but it's worth trying.
Yeah. And I mean, there's in this same context, there's this at least here, there's a big discussion now about the so-called S word, like the spiritual component in the psychedelic discussion. So, and some people want to, let's say, attach a spiritual component to a molecule or to a substance. Let's say, for example, I remember reading articles saying, yeah, psilocybin is more like a feminine substance and it makes people kind of more soft and open. And then LSD is very harsh and very, kind of strict. So, and what I really liked in your interview, I think it was at Tim Ferriss, when you said that the molecule actually itself doesn't carry the information. It's basically the human being that brings it into the experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's absolutely, it's a fact. I wouldn't personally ascribe these feminine, masculine attributes to a
Yeah.
molecule, but I know that historically that has often been the case. And that's part of a sort of animist, essentialist view of these substances that often emerges in a culture that doesn't have a materialist scientific framework for understanding these substances. So that is the framework that works for them. But we do live in a culture where people appreciate or many people appreciate the fact that these things are molecules that are inanimate constellations of carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen. The cactus just tipped over.
Okay.
And
Okay.
and so I think that it's important to appreciate that this substance is coming from us, not from the molecule. And that's, what really matters at the end of the day. That's what makes these things, I think, somewhat different from other psychoactive drugs that are operating in a simpler way psychologically. A stimulant like Ritalin, of course, it's also operating on the psychology of the individual that consumes it, but it's not as complicated experientially. It's a stimulant. It's sort of like caffeine. It just, if you're tired, it makes you more awake.
Right.
Whereas there's something that is happening with a psychedelic that is occurring at the interplay of your emotional sense, your sense of memory, your perceptual sense, and so the individual is bringing a lot more to the experience from their own consciousness, or so it feels. You could argue, I suppose, that caffeine is the same, but at least intuitively and experientially, it does feel like this is operating in a very personal, individual way that things like caffeine or nicotine are not.
I mean, it's just interesting that, let's say, if you listen to all these growing talks on Clubhouse about psychedelics, I feel like 80% is conversations are conducted in this over spiritualized language. Like it takes sometimes 10 minutes until the conversation really starts before everybody has said that it's such an amazing, spiritual, beautiful, and it's like, okay, guys, what do you actually would like to talk about? It's just that it seems to me, maybe they all come from California, these talks, I don't know, but it's just it's very interesting how this is taking, I'm not going to say taking over the narrative, but do you know what I mean? It's very much kind of accompanied by almost like a reassurance of these people that they dealing with something like almost like a religious substance, or like which it sometimes is, of course, but it's really like it really takes such a long time sometimes to cut through the chase. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'm wondering why that is.
Yeah, I think it's because there's a lot of insecurity in the world of drugs, because you are finding value in something that has been marginalized and prohibited by the society we live in. And so you're insecure. Many people are insecure. They feel like basically they feel some version of the same criticism that I experienced from my early work, and to a lesser extent from my later work, where they say, you're just doing this to get high, just to get high. And so they want to communicate in their way, no, 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 no. It's not like that. I'm not just doing this to get high. I'm doing it because I really appreciate it. And they have their own framework for showing their appreciation, which is a non-materialist spiritual framework, and so they emphasize that to show that they're serious, but it can paradoxically make them look unserious and wacky and unhinged to someone who has a more scientific standpoint. But really, science is maybe another side of the same coin, in that while maybe these people in Clubhouse are going to talk about their spiritual training or whatever, or how they, I've barely used Clubhouse. I went to one thing on it one time and I was slightly put off, I must admit, by the discussion. I never tried it again.
Yeah.
But I think what they're really is just trying to say, yes, I take this seriously. So and maybe I'm doing the same thing when I say, you want me to lecture you about the chemistry of psilocybin or DMT. I could talk to you for 10 minutes about how it's synthesized and how it's purified and the dose response and everything like that. And maybe that's my way of simply saying, I take this seriously, I care about it. But they are investing in a different way.
Yeah, makes total sense what you're saying. It's just so interesting that on Clubhouse, meaning when people actively talk about it, it becomes so much more than if you, I don't know, if you read articles or if you see some other things on YouTube. It's just that it seems like a reassurance that they're in it for the right reasons, because it's something so, what could you say against somebody who thinks of it as a highly only spiritual substance? So hardly anybody could have something against that, for example. It's just interesting how this is so dominant there, which I started to realize in the last weeks. But so this is just the beginning of Clubhouse in Europe, though. I mean, maybe this will change.
Yeah, and I'm fine with it. I'm fine with people conceptualizing these things however they want, as long as they don't let their personal concept interfere with other people's use.
Yeah.
And it really only becomes a problem when it's aggressive or turns into its own form of petty prohibitionist thinking. Like, people shouldn't be allowed to have pharmaceutical psilocybin because it lacks the spirit of the mushroom or something of that nature. And you do, of course, run into people who have that line of thought, who think that because something isn't a plant, then it lacks the spirit, and then they're kind of trying to diminish another person's type of use. Of course, I wouldn't say that about a indigenous group that feels that way, because they have a tradition and a genuine spiritual understanding, one that sometimes exists in a environment where there isn't a scientific materialist alternative. And that's a very different scenario. So
Totally.
The Native American Church of America, some members object to the idea of using mescaline as a substitute for peyote, even though peyote is endangered, it's threatened in the wild, it's overharvested, it's often harvested in an unsustainable way. And so it's very easy to make a case that synthetic mescaline would represent a more viable replacement that would make the material more accessible to a larger number of people, but they don't like that idea. And given the legacy of oppression of Native Americans, who am I to come in and say, hey, your harvesting practices might be unsustainable. You really should check out this synthetic
Yeah,
alternative to what you've been doing for the last, 100 or so years.
that's true. But I mean, I think a lot of people who would like to not have the synthetic versions often are able to fly to a retreat, whereas people at one point who might get this as medication might not be able to go on a plane and go to Costa Rica for the weekend or something. So that's also something that
Yeah.
is. But I mean, I'm curious because you met a lot of indigenous people because I mean, since we know, so you went there often for research, for doing your show. So, I mean, it's often if you watch documentaries about ayahuasca, it's very briefly that you see some people, mostly shamans, doing the ayahuasca ceremony. How was your experience, and what would you say was what's the thing you really learned from them, what you really took with you?
Well, I wouldn't say that I've learned any one thing. I've observed so many different indigenous traditions relating to psychoactive drugs, but I think that there is a lot of different small lessons. One is that there's a sort of ceremonial appreciation that isn't present in the unstructured psychedelic use that's most common in the United States. Um, the role of music, the role of community, and maybe most importantly, the role of taking it seriously. Because I think that that's another aspect of this. When I hear of somebody having a difficult experience with a psychedelic, it's often someone who simply didn't take it seriously, who they thought, okay, I was with some friends at a party and someone had a mushroom chocolate and I ate the mushroom chocolate and then I felt afraid and then I didn't know what was going on. And, this is someone who hadn't planned their experience, who didn't know the dose that they'd consumed, who hadn't carefully scrutinized the environment that they would be in. And all of those things can very easily contribute to an undesirable experience, or even one that just doesn't have the optimal benefit because you're distracted by whatever, strangers at a concert. Maybe you're distracted by fear of law enforcement. Maybe you're distracted by fear that the dose that you've taken is either too high or too low. And if you do these things simply in a way that is intentional and serious, I think you can eliminate a lot of those problems.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So, and I mean, what was the psychedelic experience that you had that really, let's say, brought you to a moment where you were like, okay, this is something I would like to look into more? I mean, probably, of course, as we know, you started very early on to experiment with this in your shows. But I mean, was there a specific experience where you realized what this could mean for you as a experience or as a future, yeah, life with psychedelics?
I think, most of the experiences really, if anything, reinforce that. My early experiences with salvia were very important because I'd never used a psychedelic previously. So those were the uh, introduction to the basic idea that there were these drugs that had very complicated, almost ineffable effects on consciousness that uh, were fascinating and kind of redefined what I thought of when I thought the word drug. And uh, and that's been basically an experience that I've had repeatedly with these things as I've tried different things. Is just, this is so fascinating. why wouldn't you care about this? People always act like it's weird to be interested in psychoactive drugs. Like they'll ask me like, why are you interested in this? How are you interested in this? Like it's, like I'm interested in repairing World War II
Yeah,
Geiger counters or
exactly.
some kind of really obscure
Yeah,
thing.
it's
And,
okay. I mean,
and, and this is like, I think one, whereas if you were interested in food, no one would ever say
no.
like, why are you interested in food? If you're interested in music, no one would say, why are you how on earth did you get interested in music? It's sort of
Hmm.
self-explanatory. Whereas with this, people, I don't really understand why, given how important drugs are to so many people. This is like one of the most important cultural forces in existence. In terms of law enforcement, in terms of medicine, in terms of history, in terms of religion. It's like hard to name something that has a more far-reaching effect on society, and yet it's still this marginalized thing. Like, how'd you get into that weird subject? It's like, this is huge, this is everything. um, and and especially because so many people in the United States, at least, consume drugs all the time. Antidepressants, nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, cannabis. This is not, it's not a subculture by any
Yeah,
stretch of imagination. It is the culture.
it's true. Yeah, but that's exactly the thing that's coming out now, right? That it's basically nicotine and caffeine could be on a similar level like other substances that are at the moment still psychedelics. So, but I mean, I find interesting that, of course, now most people would look into psychedelics in terms of, yeah, kind of enhancing their therapy or just make it more effective or even treat their depression. And I mean, last October, I started ketamine therapy. And before I had done psilocybin. So, but I think after these two things, it's almost like, even if you don't really use it in terms of mental health, like severe mental health problems, so just try to kind of, yeah, change your therapy outcome. I think after this, it's really impossible to come back to an your worldview that you had before. It's just because I feel it's so interesting once you start to communicate with your subconsciousness in a different way that it's really, to me, like, if you really think fast forward that people could just in 5 years, everybody could go to a therapist and undergo psychedelic therapy. I always wonder if how this really would change. I mean, it sounds so corny, but how this could really change this world right now. Do you ever think about these things, or is this too crazy to think about?
Oh no, of course I do. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of people that don't use psychedelics. I mean, probably something around, not including ketamine and cannabis, probably something around 90% of the population doesn't use psychedelics in the United
Sure.
States, and maybe 80. And so thinking about, well, what will happen when those people also have valuable experiences with psychedelics, and how will that change drug policy? How will that change the way we treat mental illness? I think it's a very exciting possibility that these things could help a lot of people. And I'm cautiously optimistic about what might occur. Historically, they've been such an anarchic class of substances that every time it seems like they're on the cusp of approval, something happens and they fall by the wayside and they're prohibited again, or they fall out of favor. And you know being aware of that, I'm always a little bit afraid of what might happen again. But I think that if we're able to pull it off this time, the results could be really extraordinary in a number of different domains, probably in areas we haven't even considered. That's, I think, what's most exciting is what is unknown, the things that we don't know that psychedelics can do, or that these related compounds can do. Maybe they represent very effective treatments for inflammation. Maybe this could revolutionize the way end of life care is done
Right.
in terms of, hospice or things like that. Maybe a number of different valuable outcomes could be imagined, and I'm really excited about all of it.
But do you think it's a human thing that the human being wants to change and come back as a new person a couple of times in their lives? Isn't that something I feel sometimes this is something that human beings actually are yearning for almost, in a way?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cultures, you have a rite of passage, you
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
various rituals that mark different aspects of your life trajectory. And there is very little of that in our culture. There's also, for every person that wants to transform, there are many people that are almost addicted to a sense of control,
Yeah.
and they're terrified by the idea of changing anything about themselves because they really don't like the idea of losing any aspect of control over their psychology, and they don't want to change. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that's not talked about a lot with addiction is, the first thing in trying to stop a substance that you have a problematic relationship with is you have to want to stop it. You have to say, okay, this is actually having a negative effect. I don't want this. There's many people out there that are habitual users of this or that substance that could be considered a disorder who just don't want to change. They are, for better or worse, happy with their daily use of buprenorphine or methadone or heroin or cocaine or alcohol or nicotine or Ritalin or whatever, or cannabis. And so that's, another side of this is that although there are, of course, are people that want some sort of transformation, there are probably just as many people that are afraid of transformation and want stability and control.
But I mean, this is something I talked to, I think, Ben Sessa about that. He said that he has a lot of people, patients with depression, who actually, one of the biggest obstacles for them is to say, well, if people would ask him, who are you? And say, I'm so and so, and I have depression. So what happens if, let's say, the depression becomes your identity, basically? What over years, and what if that suddenly disappears? So that's also something that's kind of coming. I feel like in a couple of scientists actually starting to research that kind of identity question in terms of mental health. Like, once this identity of you being a mental health patient, what if that disappears? Who are you then, basically?
Right. And I think that's one of the problems with medicalizing a lot of both substance use and even some forms of psychopathology, is that it can serve as a justification. So, you know, it's all fine and good if you want to talk about there being a disorder associated with substance abuse, but you have to ask yourself, well, why is that so important? I was talking to someone recently who had an article written about them where they felt a friend betrayed them, and they wrote all these horrible things that they'd done, how they'd lied to people, how they'd manipulated people, and she was saying, well, yeah, it's all true that I did these things, but why didn't they say that I was a drug addict, an amphetamine addict? Why didn't they
Okay.
acknowledge that I had a disease? Because isn't that crucial for contextualizing why I did what I did? And, the reason that this person cared so much about their amphetamine addiction being medicalized and conceptualized as a disorder is because it absolves them of responsibility for the bad things
Right.
that they did. That's why they care. I mean, if they are being honest with themselves. If it didn't, they wouldn't care. What is it's that by saying that I have a disorder, that people will then say, okay, so that
That's fine then.
explains
Yeah.
and maybe even forgives some of the things that you have done. And we do that a lot. We use drugs as excuses for bad behavior. And there isn't a culture of personal responsibility in the United States, at least. I think a lot of people are very drawn to conceptualizing themselves as victims, so that, and the reason is that if you are a victim, then you don't bear personal responsibility for the bad things that have occurred. So maybe you became addicted to OxyContin. Well, is that a choice that you made? Or are you a victim of a predatory pharmaceutical company that's evil?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a victim of a predatory pharmaceutical company, well, then maybe it's not so bad that you spent your life savings on drugs and you lost your job and you made a lot of bad decisions, because you're just you were just a victim who had a disease, and that's that. You can't blame someone that is
Right.
a
Yeah.
victim with a disease.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand why people do that, but I think that it's ultimately not good if the point is to try to create a society where we are free, because there is a price to be paid for conceptualizing yourself as a victim. If you say that you can't exist in a world where pharmaceutical opioids are available, well, then that gives the government permission to say, okay, well, then we need to prohibit these things. We need to restrict them because people aren't able to control their use in the presence of these substances, so they can't be available. So I think that's what people often forget in this short-sighted self-victimization narrative, is that there is a cost associated with it. It may seem like it's just win-win. I don't have to take responsibility for my choices if
Right.
I call myself, say that I have a disorder or I'm a victim of some kind of predatory capitalist scheme. But the cost is that you are creating a world where people feel that they don't have control over their own behaviors, and where the government feels justified in restricting people's liberty.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting point that is hardly brought up in this whole new psychedelic discussion. So, but before we go, one thing I would like to talk about is that you are looking into this, let's say, problem toad venom versus DMT, which touches a little bit on our topic, like how can substances be synthetic and have to be kind of harvested and so kind of very restricted at that point. So can you talk a little bit about that? Let's say, I mean, I think it's a very specific, a very good example how a lot of substances that are so-called like naturally grown, but just kind of rarely to get, will at one point not be replaced by synthetic substances, but we can't just rely on just only going into the fields and just take everything that basically also belongs to other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, is that the idea behind a lot of prohibitionist policy was that we've got to protect people from drugs, but it also had the effect of protecting drugs from people. And because these things have historically been somewhat marginalized, um, it hasn't been that much of a problem if people want to harvest an old ayahuasca vine, or they want to cut down an iboga shrub, or they want to harvest a lot of peyote, because not that many people were doing it. But the natural reserves of these different substances are not great enough to support a mainstream use of these substances. They will be eradicated by overharvesting. It's just a fact. And it's probably happened before in history. There's a plant called silphium that was once a medicinal plant that was harvested to the point of extinction. And it could happen again. So I think that it's just, it's all fine and good to appreciate the chemical complexity of a plant or a fungus, but it's just important to keep in mind that there's an important conservationist element that has to be acknowledged. Is it worth it to hunt toads to extinction? Is it worth it to overharvest iboga, especially when there's still basic research that needs to be done? There hadn't been any publications at all on the chemistry of Bufo alvarius venom until very recently. There was one that came out a couple months ago that was great, and there was another one maybe in 2019 that was a little more minimal. And before that, it had been almost I think the 60s that the last published report had come out. So, we're still learning basic things about what alkaloids are present in some of these materials, what the pharmacology of those alkaloids are. And I would hate to see the natural resources destroyed before we've even had the opportunity to adequately study them. Another example would be cannabis, where whether you believe in the pharmacological significance of all of these accessory cannabinoids, I think that they're often somewhat overblown in their impact. But regardless, it's very clear now that, at least from a marketing perspective, there's tremendous interest in all of these unusual cannabinoids that often are only present in some variety that has either been artificially cultivated or isolated from some obscure geographical region. And so what if we just never cultivated cannabis and it just decimated the natural population? We'd be in trouble. We couldn't do all this work that we're doing now that is dependent on having a large number of plants to analyze and understand. And that's cannabis, which is one of the most analyzed plants known to science. So we're still discovering new cannabinoids in cannabis, which has been analyzed uh, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. So you then think about something like Bufo alvarius venom or iboga that is relatively obscure, and all that is left to be understood. I did an analysis of iboga fruit recently. No one had ever published that before. There's a lot of basic research that's left to be done, and I think that it would just be tragic if people overharvested these things before we had the opportunity to fully understand them.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So I have one last question. I hope that still works with you. Is there something, because I feel psychedelics actually, what they did to me, I feel like I always have another big question that's coming out of the last experience. And I feel like, I have just done everything in a guided and like great set and setting, but still I feel like in a way I have way more questions than before. So what is your big question for psychedelics? Is there one big question that you totally would like to answer yourself, and you just, you know what I mean? They have more questions to that questions the more you get into it.
Yeah. I'm kind of an anti-big question person.
Okay, good.
I'm a great lover of small questions. I think that the small question is dramatically underappreciated, because even the small questions are often very, very big questions. So people are saying, how are we going to understand consciousness?
Yeah.
How are we going to cure depression? For like an example of a small question, I was completely fascinated by the chemistry of the blue material in psilocybin containing mushrooms. What is that? It wasn't until very recently that people even figured out what the structure of that chemical was. I wanted to figure it out. I'd done analysis on the blue pigment. It was actually somewhat difficult to analytically characterize, which is why it took people so long, and which is why I wasn't able to do it. But a brilliant group of chemists figured it out. And I love that. I love a good small question, because the nice thing about a small question is it can be answered. If the point is to actually try to answer these things and to chip away at the big questions, you have to start with small bite-sized questions. So I've got a lot of small questions that I genuinely hope to answer in the coming years, and then maybe that can be my contribution to some small part of the bigger question.
Pretty sure, yeah. That's actually a good strategy, actually. Because, it makes total sense. And so, Thank you very much. It was really interesting. And
Yeah. Have you had a chance to see any of the new show by the new
do you
season?
mean with the
Is what
one
you
with
were
the
talking
gas, with the xenon gas? Yeah.
about?
Henrik has seen it already. Let's talk
Yeah,
about the show
less
now.
interesting, less interesting to me, and I think it's just less interesting work. Whereas the new stuff
Yeah,
is really worth checking out.
it is. Yeah.
The third season has a lot of fascinating work. Depending on where you're located, it can be a little bit difficult to
Yeah.
track down, but you can torrent it. You can
Yeah.
get it on Amazon, get it on iTunes,
Yeah.
get it on YouTube. It's certainly circulating, and I also have a podcast that I've been making now as well that you can
Oh,
listen
okay.
to at
Right.
patreon.com
The whole,
slash
you have a whole Patreon channel, you could say, right? I mean, there's not only a
yeah
podcast.
yeah
But I mean, let's quickly
yeah
talk about this. So you went to this clinic and tried this specific gas. So
yeah and that's just one episode
yeah,
from the new season. It's 6 new pieces that I think are all interesting, but yes, one of them was at a Czech
check.
xenon clinic. Yeah.
And how did you actually find that at all, this clinic?
I mean, I found it the way I find a lot of things, which is just talking to people. I never studied journalism or anything like that, but I talk to people all the time and I listen to the stories that people have. And it's always amazing to me how, even having been in this world, thinking about it every day for a decade, how there are things that I don't know about that I can learn about. And someone said, hey, what's the deal with these xenon clinics? And I had tried xenon in 2014 because a chemist friend of mine had a tank of it in New Zealand. And I thought I was essentially one of the only people to try it. I knew that there had been some small medical studies that had been done, and a couple of psychonaut types had tried it. But I thought, okay, that's a one off experience. That's a little wonderful, rare opportunity that I had. I'll never have it again. But I can always remember the time that I inhaled a little bit of xenon gas in 2014. What a treat that was. And and then somebody contacted me and they said, hey, there's clinics that are doing this. I'd never heard anything about it because at the time there was nothing written about it in English. If you looked online, this was something that existed in Russia, in the Czech Republic, possibly in India, possibly some other places, but certainly not in the United States. And I almost didn't believe it. And then I was connected with the proprietor of one of these clinics, and it was a whole world that opened up that I didn't know about. It was totally fascinating.
But when you say it was such a treat, what exactly? Now it's a small question. What was exactly the treat?
Well, the treat in that case is raw, unadulterated euphoria. There's something very psychologically interesting about the classical psychedelics where they can promote self-reflection, self-awareness, critical self-observation, metacognition, all these things that are useful in self-understanding. This did not have that. This is, just intense, ultra hedonistic euphoria, like someone has flipped a switch in your brain to give you a sense of maximum pleasure for a few moments that then dissipates.
Okay.
And so psychologically not so interesting, but pharmacologically very interesting. And people are even trying to use that now as a treatment for PTSD.
Oh,
There's a
okay.
pharmaceutical
Okay.
company in the United States that's trying to release a xenon inhaler so that
Right.
people can
The
use.
inhaler.
Yeah.
But I mean, as far as
Yeah.
I remember from the Tim Ferriss episode, it was pretty dramatic in that clinic.
It was dramatic, yes. Yeah. It was, and that's another thing that, we were talking at the beginning of the discussion about the responsibility
Yeah.
associated with these things. I'm certainly not, I don't even really consider myself a journalist, and I'm certainly not a journalist in the sense that I want to expose people or write negative things about people. I just would prefer not to even involve myself with somebody if I don't want to say something nice about them. I never go into any of these projects with the desire to try to
Yeah.
take someone
No, of
down.
course. Yeah.
But, well, I mean, many people do kind of have this desire to diminish people for one
Yeah, I
reason or
mean, I think
another.
that's an old. I mean, I feel here this is a very old idea of journalism where you just come in to I mean, criticism and exposure is your only goal of things. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, but tell if you want to, it would be interesting to how this,
Yes.
yeah.
So I didn't want to say anything negative about them, and even some of the more controversial things that they were doing, like giving xenon to children, which you could say, well, how on earth could they possibly justify doing that? Well, based on everything that's known about the pharmacology and toxicology of xenon, it's probably safer to give it to a child than nitrous oxide, which is routinely given to children. So that was a little weird, but it wasn't something that I felt justified calling them out for their unsafe practices. But as I spent more time at this clinic, it became clear that the fact that the proprietors were not medically trained was a problem. There was somebody who almost aspirated on their vomit, could have been fatal. Thankfully, it wasn't. And there was also some early indication that the people who were working there, who I liked personally,
Mm-hmm.
I wish I think they're fine people. I think their heart was in the right place. I think that they just found themselves in the presence of a tool that they were not fully equipped to use responsibly. And that's often the case. These are very, very powerful tools, and people can become almost addicted, not just to the drug, but to the power of what the drug does to other people. You see that a lot in the toad venom community, that people become almost addicted to the transformation that they observe when they give it to others. And so I think that maybe something a little bit similar was happening, where
Ah,
they
interesting.
were seduced by the power of what they were doing, and they were a little bit incautious. And ultimately, one of the people at the clinic died shortly after I had finished filming there. And so
Wow.
that was a really sad um, confrontation with the fact that, yeah, these things can be dangerous, even if, if you look at the medical literature, xenon is very safe, it's non-toxic, but you have to inhale oxygen at the same time. You can't just inhale xenon. So if you're not administering it with that level of awareness, tragic things can happen.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, it sounded pretty. I mean, it must be a very strange moment when you also filmed the whole thing and then something like this happens. But I mean,
Yeah.
last question because we could go on forever. And so, I mean, how would you like to that people would talk and film and write about psychedelics in the coming years? I mean, obviously, it's going into a mainstream. You have like Condé Nast magazines writing about ketamine clinics. Ketamine clinics look like Soho House. So obviously, there's a huge step forward in terms of, I mean, the short version would be like that it comes into the mainstream also at one point into psychiatry. But still, as we said earlier, it's still a very specific. I mean, it's very quick that you can make many mistakes in communicating it, why it's so great, or why you should do it, or how it could replace your antidepressant. So, what is your biggest desire to communicate this in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that journalists have to be aware of the power that they have, because I think they often don't fully appreciate that. They just write some article like, you know, Delta 8 THC, it's the new hot cannabinoid. And they don't think, well, what are the policy implications of this? What are the toxicological implications of this? And I hope that people understand how much responsibility is associated with talking about these things, and that people are cautious and don't push their hysteria in one direction or another, because it seems like there's always a good guy and a bad guy in
Mm-hmm.
these narratives. And usually, at least in the way that, the way that they're presented, there's a good guy and a bad guy. In reality, there isn't. But people still want to fall into these patterns where maybe in the past, the bad guy was the drug dealer, or the
Right.
bad guy
Yeah.
was the person that used the drug. Even now, the bad guy is going to be the pharmaceutical
Right. Yeah.
company.
Totally.
Uh, And so that's going to be the fashionable way to report on this, is figure out a way to write some shrill and moralistic objection to the pharmaceutical implementation of psychedelics. Well, I think people should be vigilant, and I absolutely think that should something truly unethical occur, that it should be reported on. But I also think that once there's an established demand for a certain type of story, like an evil pharmaceutical company story, then people stop seeing the bigger picture and they start just sort of robotically repeating the same narratives where it's like, and I understand where people are coming from with this anti-pharmaceutical stuff. They're kind of thinking about it in terms of what is ideal, like, and sometimes idealism can interfere with a more pragmatic attitude toward this area that historically has been a total disaster. So it's like people are saying like, oh, the pharmaceutical companies are not the ideal way to do this. Well, I in part agree. I think that everything should be possible. I think people should be able to cultivate and synthesize their own psychedelics. I think pharmaceutical companies should be able to sell them. I think there should be a FDA approved therapeutic modality. I think there should be unstructured therapy for, I think whatever people want, I think it should be available. I have a laissez-faire attitude toward this. But I think when people get so caught up in saying that it should be this way
Yeah,
and only this way,
totally.
they're not appreciating how extraordinary it is that this is happening at all. You know, it very easily could not be happening at all. We could have the same situation where there's no resources for research, where there's no hope of these things being FDA approved medicines, where people are still getting locked in cages for using and possessing and manufacturing these things. And any step in the right direction is something that I support.
Great. Well, thank you, Hamilton. It was amazing to have you on the show. And I hope you come back soon with another round of new news from the chemist, from your new career as a chemist, or your old new career as a chemist.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.